I'm Dr. Christy Gardner. I think I know all the folks that are here today. This is the third and final Fine Arts Salon of the fall semester, and I'm so pleased to introduce my newest colleague, Dr. Chris Underration. I'm hoping that some of you, if not most of you, have either seen him on campus or in a Zoom space near you. He's been teaching a number of classes for us this fall, and what's great about Chris's background is that he brings both an academic and a professional background, which is something that we, as you know, we focus on in our department. So Dr. Underration, in his professional career, he's worked as a radio announcer. He's worked as a journalist, a news reporter. He has also worked in the area of PR and advertising, as well as holding advanced degrees in religion and communication. So we're just so pleased that he has joined our communication arts faculty. And let me just take a quick peek if I can find the announcement of his time with us today. It sounds like a great topic for right now. This was the title that he gave us for our salon today, Thinking About Social Justice, a Reconsideration of John Rawls's Theory of Justice for the Digital Era. And this was the question that he posed. He said, Rawls's theory of justice has been described as wise and elegant since it was first published 50 years ago, but is it realistic as a practical concept, especially in the digital age? And so with that, I want to turn this over to Dr. Underration to challenge us and inspire us as you share some of your thinking and your research with us. Dr. Underration.
Great, thanks, Dr. Gardner, I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for dropping by. Before we get started, first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about this whole issue of social justice, because we talk about it a lot. But when we talk about it, what are we actually talking about? What is justice? What does it look like? How do we know when we've achieved it? Do we ever achieve it? Can we ever achieve it? These are all the sorts of things that when we're talking about big issues like this, we should take some time to reflect upon, because if we don't, we can sometimes end up being like the dog chasing its tail. We're constantly in motion, but we don't seem to be gaining ground. So one of the things that this particular discussion tonight, the genesis for it, I'll explain that in a moment. But the reason that John Rawls matters is because he is one philosopher in the modern era, within the last half century, who's attempted to define how justice is achieved. And this is something that when I first started to come in contact with it, was curious about, because I admit at first it struck me funny that we would have a theory about it. But the more I looked into the theory, the more I realized there's maybe a little bit more here going on than meets the eye. So what I want to do is share a screen with you. And while we go through this, if you have questions, will you just do me a favor and butt in? You can just say, hey, stop, hold on just a minute. I will ask some questions too, because one of the things about John Rawls' theory, I have a book here that I'll reference a little bit later. You really can't see the title, but it's Understanding Rawls. So people have been writing books about trying to understand this guy. So hopefully I'm going to try to help you understand it, and then we're going to point out the flaws in the theory. And I have an idea, because as a matter of the sort of academic side of my communication work, I like to argue and talk and try to fix things that need to be fixed. So talking about how we got here, back in 2012, I published an article, and you can see the little headline there, called The Art of the Impossible. And this was published by the American Communication Journal. And in this paper, we examined the approach and the rhetoric that Barack Obama used at his healthcare summit. So this was something when he finally decided after his first election, that I'm now going to address American healthcare. He had a summit, it was televised, and there was a lot of talk about it at the time. And in listening to that, it occurred to me that Barack Obama is Rawlsian, oh my, because the way that he was talking about this idea of extending healthcare to all. It was framed in a moral argument, in a justice and social justice argument. And as he talked about it, it became apparent that at some point I would want to study this as a rhetoric piece, an artifact. But when I started to read Rawls, I actually decided that what I was going to do was point out Barack Obama, how he's Rawlsian and how he does his stuff, but how John Rawls actually misses the point. And so that's really what this particular article is about. And then I decided at some point I was going to pick up the next part of this, which was fixing John Rawls. So this is where we're at tonight, is fixing John Rawls. And the one thing that I would like to say is this is a working paper. So it's not like written down, it's not etched in stone. And I might be as clueless as the day is long. And if I'm saying something and you're saying, hold on there, I just don't think that really hits the mark, I'm up for hearing it. Because when we're talking about this issue, again, since social justice is an issue in our nation right now, and it will be for the foreseeable future, when we talk about social justice, we should talk about how we achieve social justice. Because if we don't talk about that and be clear about it, we will achieve nothing. And that's, I think, where we've come up short in a lot of our actions heretofore. So let's talk a little bit about John Rawls. This is the man, John Rawls. In 1971, he decided, in the aftermath of all the protests and all of the upheaval of the 1960s, that he was going to write this book called A Theory of Justice. And Rawls wrote it because he was having a hard time with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and John Locke. Now, who are those folks? The three of them put together, but John Locke in particular, is the philosophical underpinning for the United States as we have it now. And when you go back and read our founding fathers in their writings and sort of their meditations about how we're establishing this new nation, oftentimes they cite John Locke directly. And the three of these men had something altogether that is just generally classified as the social contract. And what is the social contract? Are there any political science folks here or people who are sort of students of government? Okay, just wanted to see, because if there are, certainly you know about the social contract. Basically, what this says is, in the case of John Locke, it is the people who give the government its power. And when government exercises power, it is not to exercise power for its own purposes. The government is to exercise its power for the good of the people who give the government its power. So basically, when you exercise power, you're exercising it governmentally by permission from the people. So let me ask, in your estimation right now, do you think that we are seeing government exercising its power by permission, or is it exercising its power out of its own prerogatives? Go ahead and just speak up. Let me ask a slightly different way. Do you believe the American people are directing the government right now? Or is the government directing the people? Be bold, step forth into the abyss.
I'll step forth. Because I
Okay.
think I don't know the answer, right? I mean, especially every headline I'm reading post-election, or are we post? Are we in the middle of the election, right? I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that question right now. It's a good
I think,
question for right now.
yeah, okay. I think one of the things that, and again, hopefully we're thinking along these lines, Typically, we answer that question according to the party in power and whether we agree with the party in power or not. So, for example, the Trump administration is still in, and I think that the people who support the Trump administration would say he's operating under the permission of the people. The people who are against Donald Trump would say, no, no, they're exercising power on top of the people, not by permission of the people. And this is precisely the issue that John Rawls got him thinking. This whole theory upon which our American government is based, the social contract of Locke, Kant, and Rousseau, has failed us. And it's failed us because governments, politics, politicians are manipulating people right now. They do things to get us to vote, to act, to move in a certain way. They're not focused on issues of justice. They're focused on issues of power retention. And as a result, the government gets to then break in on people's liberty in order to preserve the social contract. And that's always how they do it. So when you hear a politician stand up and say something like this, the American people want, and maybe if you hear that, you think to yourself, well, I don't know, I'm the American people and I'm not sure I want. So if that's the case, what do you do? Well, this is why John Rawls developed his theory of justice, because he wanted to try to fix what he considered to be a broken social contract. So this is the stuff that John Rawls came up with. Okay, John Rawls proposes the idea that before we can do anything in the justice way, that all of us of our own volition and will have to revert to the original position. That's what he calls it. Now, this original position basically is supposed to, again, out of our own actions, we voluntarily revert back to a time when we were not in power, authority, not when we held any position, not when we were aware of our wealth or standing or lack of standing in society. So to get to this position, you and I, Rawls says, have to act as if we are behind a veil of ignorance. And that's what he calls it, the veil of ignorance. And in this veil of ignorance, we remove the biasing understanding of our social and cultural standing. So think about where you're at right now, wherever you're at in life, whether you're faculty, student, staff, your employee, whatever it is that you are. You right now are supposed to be behind a veil of ignorance so that none of that is consciously known by you so that you will not act on it. Okay, now let me ask you, is this possible?
These are some pretty hard questions to start off the salon with.
That's right. Just kind of, breaking you in a little bit. The easy ones come later. But do you think it's possible for us to revert to like some type of original position where we can basically forget and set aside social standing, cultural standing, position in society, basically wherever we are? This would be racial standing, social standing, standings of all sorts, so that we are making ourselves the same as others.
Well, I'm just thinking, in fact, coming up in a week or so in COM 205, we're covering standpoint theory, which would actually be just opposite of that, right? So suggesting that if you were to remove that, what's left? Like if those are such clear identity markers, like if we were to do that, I'm not sure what Rawls would say would be left if we didn't have those things.
What Rawls is proposing, though, is something different. He's saying the only way that we can reach justice is for all of us to revert to the original position. Before there was standing, before there were winners, before there were losers, before there were people that you would look up to and say, I want to be like that, or you would look down at people and say, well, I'm glad I'm not like that. Maybe we should do something to help this person down here. And he's saying that this is the only way that justice can really occur. And then he says he has a couple of other principles: the principle of basic equal liberty for all, and the difference principle. And basically what he says is, when you put these two principles together, inequality in a society is okay as long as it is to everyone's advantage, especially those in the lower classes. Okay, so if you think about this for a minute, basically what he's saying is inequality is okay, but somebody needs to make a principled distinction about this being to everyone's advantage. It's really not entirely possible, it strikes me, right? I mean, it's just not something that we can easily achieve, because inequality still would tend to bring about some sense of injustice. But, so let me ask this. We recently, in our recent past, have had arguments and fusses over the one percenters and things of that sort. And we hear politicians say things like, we need to tax the 1% more, tax the rich, that whole idea. This is actually Rawlsian in its general approach. Okay, we want to basically take from people who should, if they're proper and they've reverted to the original position and they're behind the veil of ignorance, won't mind having their things taken and given to others. But in reality, do we see this happening? Does this happen in our culture? Do the rich stand by, say, and let people tax them and then redistribute their wealth to people who have needs? Do we see this?
I don't think so, because I think that is a good reason for why the gap is so large and increasing, because if it was being redistributed, then slowly that margin might close a little bit.
Right. And you're exactly right, Tiffany. That's spot on. If this were working, we wouldn't be seeing the increasing inequality that we have in culture. And this shows the absolute failure of John Rawls, because Rawls has practical flaws, right? As a Christian, we all should, I think, easily see the flaws. And one of them is we simply can't decide to revert to original position. What keeps us from doing that as humans? Think theologically here.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. So as a Christian, we simply can't decide to revert to an original position because there is something that keeps us from doing this. But we have to think theologically about this. So what would that be that keeps us from basically reverting to an original position?
Dr. Underration, I just have a clarification question.
Yeah.
The original position, does that mean taking away any sort of classification or like categorization? Like just like everyone like completely on the same, like, or does it just have to do with class?
No, it's pretty much everything. So we're putting ourselves in a position of complete equality with others. So that would be, if I'm someone, say, who is very middle class, I would have to set aside some of my middle classness for the sake of those who are below me, and those who are in classes above me economically, racially, socially, educationally would need to set aside those things as well, so that we can all be together and make decisions based on common good, not common interests. Okay. So why can't we just revert to an original position, to the original position, would you say? Think back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, although practically it sounds like it could be a really good idea, putting everyone on the same or at the same level, I think is an inequality or an injustice as well. Like, just putting it, the way I see it is, humans are much more than just commodities. We have stories, we have history. And putting everyone on the same playing field, I think, gets rid of that. And so I think in my book, it'll be in injustice to kind of rid people of the past just for the sake of leveling the playing field for everyone to kind of feel ordinary and the same. And even then, I don't think it would be much useful. Although, like, practically, it sounds like it would be a great idea if you want to live in some sort of like utopia, I guess. But I think, like, personally, if we want to include like personal experiences and stories, and if we want to include like the just the idea of uniqueness and like specialty, I don't think it would be helpful to at all to do that in any way. So like
Yeah.
that's a huge flaw.
Yeah, right. See, and what you've laid out is one of the primary critiques of Rawls. So you actually have, sort of, you followed along in this book a little bit, because he says something similar, that these differences that we have are how we actually solve problems, because people have experience that is necessary. And it's not just redistributing the stuff, basically. And maybe if you were tuned into politics at that time, you remember Barack Obama getting a lot of criticism for talking about basically sharing the wealth. And people were like, what? You're talking about socialism, redistribution. And this is the critique that often comes. For Christians, the original position fails because we believe in a sin nature, that the reason that we come to Christ is because we're sinners, and sinners are selfish, and we can't make ourselves unselfish, right? We just can't. We by nature are so selfish and self-centered in what we do that the original position just isn't a practical reality for anybody. But for Christians, we would at least acknowledge it and say, that's me. I'm not able. So even though we may occasionally act against our self-interest in things, and we do, there have been times when it would be in our self-interest to do this, but for the sake of someone else, we do that, like maybe our boyfriend, our girlfriend, our parents, or our roommate, or whatever. We'll put ourselves out for them and do something that's really inconvenient for us. But that's pretty much a one-off and not our standard mode of living. So basically, this theory of justice becomes a top-down way of seeing social fairness take place, right? So the people who are above, who have the most to give up, are expected to sort of step aside, and then they get to practically decide, well, it's good to grant justice now, so we'll do that. And it becomes not this sort of social contract, which is the people below giving the people above permission. It's really the people above deciding when the people below can get justice. And that's kind of what this theory comes to at a certain point. So again, this is some of the criticism, and you've already talked about some of this, so we don't need to spend a lot of time here. But in this book, this Robert Wolff book, he does say this is an elegant, great theory. So David, what you were saying there about this being, it sounds like a good idea, and it seems in theory that it could be a good idea. In theory, yeah. And a lot of people have said this, and this is basically what this book says. In theory, this is good. In practicality, can't work. In fact, Rawls, in some things, is just wrong in what he assumes. So this is what we get back to. So what is justice? And basically, the way that this particular theory leaves us looking at justice is this way. One group feels the need to be fairly treated, and then the so-called group above with the veil of ignorance and back in the original position, they decide what to give that group. And they do it because they're, the bigger person, they're the person behind the veil. They're not acting on self-interest. And we do applaud people who act that way. But basically, again, it's a top-down kind of theory. The other thing, too, is that this is coercive in nature. So this is one of the biggest flaws in this whole conception of justice. One of the issues that we really need to think about when we're talking about social justice is injustice acceptable when we're seeking social justice. And we should think about this because in the way that we do certain things and bring about justice, we do get cries. Sometimes they're not logically sound, but sometimes we do, where people say, well, that is not just. And basically what it does is it creates another division, even while we're trying to heal another division. So as a result, we never get justice. We get this rolling issue of increasing hurts. So John Rawls, after he wrote The Theory of Justice, got a lot of critique, and he followed up with this book called Political Liberalism. And this is liberal used in the sense of the Western government style, the Western liberal democracy of deliberative governments, of the people deciding, taking votes, and ruling, based on majority or some type of Republican rule. Basically, in this book, though, he talks about this thing called an overlapping consensus. And this overlapping consensus is basically ideas and policies that all people within that liberal political tradition hold. So as people who are living in the Western liberal political tradition, you and I would agree that voting is a good thing. We would agree that protests for redress of grievances against the government is a good thing. We would agree that sometimes serving others for the greater good is a proper thing. These are all sort of Western liberal ideas, and they would be part of an overlapping consensus. And basically what Rawls says is people who hold these large sort of Western liberal beliefs are people who are quote unquote reasonable people. And people who are reasonable tend toward justice. But people who hold views other than these are unreasonable and therefore forfeit the right to be heard. Okay, now, do you see an issue with those two things? People who are reasonable hold Western liberal ideals. People who hold other ideals would be unreasonable and forfeit the right to a hearing.
That statement kind of contradicts itself, in a lot of ways.
It does. Can you just come up with one way that it does? Because this is something actually that happened in the healthcare summit when Barack Obama was talking. And I'll explain it, but do you see a way, Rachel, that it happens?
Yes, let me think if I can put it into words. But okay. It's if I understand correctly, it's saying that people who, I'm just verbally processing, in Western societies who believe that voting and the freedom to vote, that's something reasonable, while people who have the opposite or a different belief that voting isn't the way to justice, they're saying that that's unreasonable. But then it's it's funny because you would assume that people who agree with voting would want everyone to have a voice, because that's literally the whole point of voting. But then they are negating people who are against, who have an opposite belief than they do.
Yeah.
Which is against, yeah. I don't know if that made sense, but.
No, it does. Actually, It does make sense. Because if you're a reasonable person, there's no unreasonable person out there who's going to say, I'm unreasonable, sure. Everybody thinks they're reasonable, right? Even the craziest person out there. So if that's the case, then you begin to pick winners and losers because you have to, right? You're reasonable, you're unreasonable. And this is what makes this theory somewhat coercive as a matter of justice. And this is an example from Barack Obama's healthcare summit. So in 2009, when he had this summit, he basically was setting the framework for the discussion of the healthcare reboot. And what he said here is in the second bullet point: all voices will be heard, all options are up for discussion, no one dominates the discussion. Okay, this all sounds perfectly reasonable, right? I think we would all say this is good. Yeah, all voices are heard, all options are up for discussion, no one dominates discussion. This is great. But he said this, but there is no blocking the idea of reform. So when ideas came out, there were some people who were part of the summit who said, we don't like any of these options. These are all bad options. And they said, we would like a start over. And Barack Obama at that point said, no, that's unreasonable, because the rules were clear. Nobody gets to dominate discussion, and you're trying to dominate, so you are unreasonable and you are out of the discussion. And that's part of the reason why the healthcare law ultimately, in a rhetorical sense, evolved the way it did. Because if you weren't buying into the ideas that were set forth by the administration and you wanted to discuss other ideas or start again, you were viewed as unreasonable under Rawls, so you had forfeited your right to a hearing. And that's kind of how this whole thing practically developed. And this is the coercive nature of this Rawlsian philosophy. So we need some fixes here. And these are the fixes. These are the 3 points for this working paper that I'm working on. We need a theory, first of all, that fits human nature, because a theory that doesn't fit human nature is never going to work in the real world. And in all honesty, Rawls does not fit human nature. It just doesn't. So as a result, it doesn't really work in that just way. It actually creates more injustice. We also need a theory that encourages stakeholders to do the right thing. And this is something else. With Rawls, there's not really an encouragement to do the right thing. It's an expectation that you're going to do the right thing. But as fallen individuals who tend to be selfish, we tend to look to ourself first. We need to encourage people to do the right thing. So this is what this theory ultimately needs to have. And it needs to bring the right type of justice to people or groups who are oppressed or marginalized. And this is, I think, where my theory can definitely go off the rails, okay? Because when I'm talking about the right type of justice, what am I talking about? And I'm gonna answer my own question by saying, that's a good question. I don't know that I yet know what I'm actually talking about there. But what I do believe is that it's not top-down decision-making like with Rawls. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about how this is going to happen a little bit. So again, remember the 3 big ideas. It has to fit human nature, encourage people to do the right thing, the stakeholders, and bring the right type of justice to people or groups who are oppressed or marginalized. Okay, so this is the Rawls reboot. So I'm going to maintain the following. We can't get back to the original position due to our sinful human nature. When this paper is ultimately presented at a conference, I expect that I'm going to get beaten around the head and shoulders about this pretty roundly. But there's no moving me off of it, because I do believe that our sinful human nature means that we can't in any consistent way revert to any type of original position or put on some veil of ignorance. Okay, we're always going to know our advantages and our disadvantages, and we're going to insist on our advantages where they come. So we do, in this proposal, need to appeal to common interests. Okay, and this is actually something that Rawls, in his theory, does allow for. And the one thing that this theory will say is that justice looks different to people who are basically at ground level. So the people who are agitating for justice, wherever they're agitating for justice, it looks different to them than it does to people who are above,
maybe I should
who are not agitating for justice.
Oh, yeah, I do speak.
Oh, sorry, is there a question? Or maybe someone just isn't muted, sorry. Okay, so justice looks different depending on the lens that you're using, right? And that's one thing. Social justice, by the way, in this proposal is not a gift given by the elites. It's a right promised to everyone. So here is sort of like the big turn for me. I'm gonna scrap the original position and the veil of ignorance. And I'm going to say what we're looking for is a mantle of understanding. Okay. And the idea is that it's like, like my hoodie here. When it's cold, I'm going to reach for this hoodie and all becomes well. And I know what to do and I know what to get in order to make myself warm. It's a mantle of understanding. And this idea creates awareness from the people who need justice. So basically, you're looking at what people are saying, and then you're amplifying it in different ways through different means to different audiences. Okay, so as opposed to Rawls, which is much more top-down, the people above put on the veil of ignorance. They decide justice is good here and we're going to grant it to these people who are oppressed or marginalized. This is actually more of a two-way type or three-way even type of communication, where people who are marginalized are stating their case. People are hearing it and amplifying it through the media, through the social media, through digital means, all the stuff that we have actually seen within this calendar year of 2020. When we had a lot of the protests following Breonna Taylor, when we had the protests following George Floyd, these were not things that came about out of nothing. They were actually organized through social media. People made their case, people showed up, and the awareness of a need became known. The mantle of understanding began to descend on people. So here's basically how this works. So once the mantle of understanding begins to descend, when we look at social justice, particularly today, it seems easy, I think, because things just seem to appear to fall into place, right? I mean, sometimes, and I don't know if any of you had this feeling, maybe some of us older folks among the crowd did, but there were some things that happened that were like, wow, I never thought I would see that happen. But it happened, and it seemed to be fast, but it wasn't actually fast. It was actually slow. It was a process. So when we're talking about social justice, a lot of times I think our mindset is social justice is an event, but it's not. It's a process. And this is what this theory wants to make clear, that when we're talking about social justice, we're not talking about an event. Because if you want social justice as an event, you'll be waiting forever, because that's not how it happens. Social justice is a process. And to give you a sense of this, I actually talked about this in a class today. In the spring, I have connections to Hampton University down in Virginia. And I was standing in the office of the Scripps Howard School of Journalism and Communication there, watching CNN with a gentleman by the name of Earl Caldwell. Earl was a reporter with the New York Times, and in the 1960s, his beat was Martin Luther King. So he was the only reporter on the balcony in Memphis when Martin Luther King was shot. And so he is truly like a civil rights icon. So I'm talking to him about this. And, he looked at me and he said, actually, I looked at him and I said, it looks like the 1960s. And he looked at me and he said, nope, not the 1960s at all. And I said, really? And he said, look at all the white people. And I looked back at the screen. It's like, there are a lot of white people there. And he said, in the 1960s, after Dr. King, it was the Black people carrying the message to the culture, and it didn't resonate widely, he said. We made progress, but it didn't resonate. But look at all these white faces, he said. This is change. Because, as he told me, he looked at me and he said, white people listen to white people. And this is Earl's take on this process of social justice, that we have made progress, and he admitted so that there's been good progress that has been made since the 1960s. It's not that nothing has happened, but we still have not arrived. And he said, what we need is to further the process, basically. And here's how that process gets done with these 4 bullet points. the steady erosion of the foundations of injustice by constant awareness. One of the things that happens is we often get focused on what I call the shiny object, whatever the shiny object is. And we focus on it and we talk about it, and then another shiny object comes our way and we forget about this other object. But when we're talking about social justice, if we're serious about bringing it forward, it is constant awareness that has to be brought to the foundations of injustice. Constant. This should not stop. And a consistent reminder of the promises of the US Constitution. These two things have to work together. A constant reminder of the Constitution and the promises that exist there for not just a certain group of people, but for every people, which most people now find non-controversial. Okay, so that idea has, I think, mostly been won. But looking at the foundations of injustice, I'm not sure that has been won yet. I think it's still working. But again, the constant, steady awareness needs to erode those foundations. And then along with that is regular communication to the elites of the country, of the benefits that can accrue to them by taking this particular action. So this is the other part of it, finding your stakeholders and appealing to benefits. And then there needs to be some type of major triggering act. And these acts do occur fairly regularly in our culture. This year, we've had a lot of them. Some years we have slightly fewer, but these social justice triggering acts then show us how redress of wrong can benefit all. Okay, are there any questions about this? Because I want to show you a recent example of how this happened. An issue of social justice for something that has been literally going on for about 20 years now. And it's kind of small by comparison to the big issues, but it's an example, I think, that shows how this theory can work. But are there any questions here about this? Okay, if not, here's one example. It's the Washington football team. Okay, now I want to talk about this because I actually am from Cleveland, Ohio. My favorite baseball team is the Cleveland Indians. Since the late 80s, at every opening day, an Indian tribe has been outside the stadium where the Indians are playing to make their case. They've been doing it faithfully every year now for 20, 30 years now. And they've been saying, this name is racist, this name is unjust. And the Indians for a long time have held off. Okay, but this year, there's been a change in that dynamic. And it came about in part because in the law, there's a case, it's just called the Slants case, okay? And this is about a band of an Asian American band. They're called the Slants. And they were denied booking, they were denied promotion because of their name, the Slants. Because the person said, that is a racially insensitive name. And they're like, we're Asians. And they're like, sorry, you can't do it. So the Slants sued, especially when they tried to trademark the name, they were denied for a trademark. So they sued. And this case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said it's a name that should be trademarked. It's legal. So the Slants basically gave Daniel Snyder of the Redskins at that time the ability to go out in public and say, as he said, we will never change the name Redskins. It's not racist. It's not meant to be insensitive. It's not unjust. And we're never going to change the name. And that's how things sat pretty much for about, say, close to a decade. And the Indian tribes, though, and the activists around this particular issue continued to write, they continued to speak, they continued to protest, they continued to wear away to erode the foundations of this type of injustice. And then when you had the precipitating act, which seems unrelated, but it's really not, and that's George Floyd's death and the protests that then began to expose injustices of many types, people began to pay attention. And because of the Indian tribes' consistent, regular work at undermining, because of their discussions upward to the elites, what ended up happening was Nike, FedEx, and PepsiCo, all major sponsors to the tunes of millions and millions and millions of dollars, were reached out to by Indian tribes and protesters around this specific social justice issue. And Nike, FedEx, and PepsiCo, for the first time, said, you know, we think you might have a point. And they informed Daniel Snyder, we think they may have a point. And what did Daniel Snyder do? Daniel Snyder said, well, then even though I, in the fairly recent past, said we would never change the name, suddenly it's in my self-interest to change the name. And this is how this all came about. So this is an example of how this type of thing can happen. How social justice can happen under this mantle of understanding, because Dan Snyder was about as immovable as you can get. Even earlier this year in 2020, there were articles about, you know, we need to get Daniel Snyder to sell the team so maybe a new owner will change the name, because he never will. And, you know, people were, you know, criticizing Snyder and everything else. But all of this happened in 2020. And it looks like Daniel Snyder folded within a matter of about a month or so after George Floyd. But that's not the case. The groundwork for all of this was laid well before it. And basically, it was just taking a rotten structure and basically just pushing it over. So I have a group of friends, and we go up into the White Mountains of New Hampshire every fall. We hike. And one of the things that we do, why? I don't know, because we're just dumb guys. We walk through, we see trees, and they're a little tall and rotten, and we'll just sit there and push on it with our hands until the whole thing falls over. And we think that's really something because we pushed over a tree, but the tree was completely rotten. And that's kind of the idea here, is that a lot of these things that look so impregnable as far as social justice issues go are really not as impregnable as they might seem if we're consistently speaking and eroding the foundations of injustice. So here's some other examples recently. Bubba Wallace, NASCAR, and the Confederate battle flag. Okay, if there is ever an agency, an organization that went against its audience, it is NASCAR. I live in Virginia, and believe me when I tell you, when NASCAR comes to town, the Confederate flags are everywhere. On trailers, on trucks, you know, people are wearing them. But during this whole situation of the similar timeline to Dan Snyder and everything else, again, with George Floyd as the precipitating act, NASCAR banned the Confederate battle flag at all of its properties. You may not bring them, you may not wear them, they may not be on the property. And this is clearly against their audience. And this just goes to show how social justice, even when it's not fully in the best interests of an organization, because it could end up costing NASCAR fans. And it may not bring in new fans, that's not for sure. But they acted this way. And they did it on issues of social justice. It was in their estimation, in their best interest as an organization to do it, even though their audience says no. You have the Cleveland Indians. The Cleveland Indians, after years of not doing anything, got rid of Chief Wahoo, which is the red-faced Indian they used to wear on their hats. You won't see Chief Wahoo on the hats or uniforms anymore. They did that about a year or so ago, and they announced that they are going to evaluate a name change. So they may actually change their name. And this is something that just a few years ago seemed like it would never happen. You've got the Mississippi state flag. This is the heart of the old Confederacy here. You know, they had the Confederate battle flag on their state flag, and they have, in fact, just last week, voted this new flag in that you see here in the slide. So here's the thing. All of these things seem to be quick decisions, but they really were not. They were things that happened over time. Processes, constant communication, constant erosion, constant communicating to the elites of the benefits of taking certain actions, because the nature of humans is to act in self-interest. So we just need to provide, when it comes to issues of social justice, the right self-interested reasons for people to take action. And if we can do that, then we will see that action be taken ultimately. Because the one thing is, social justice is not a gift of the elites to people below them. It's just not. Basically, justice is our right, but injustice gets enshrined because of the fallenness of human nature. And we just need to work through it. And I think a reboot of this theory can help make this happen, because then we actually have a theory, a way forward for social justice. So any questions or comments or just general thoughts about this? Because that's pretty much all I have for you right now.
I'll jump in and just first of all say thank you. This is so fascinating. It's given me a lot to chew on, and I think everyone else probably that's joining here as well. But the one thing I guess that it leaves me, so I understand this twist, the self-interest angle to it, but it also leaves me kind of discouraged in a way. It seems, and maybe not in all of these examples, but it seems very, what would I say, capitalist driven, so that it's only at the point at which, so I guess in the other case, like if my business is going to be affected, then I will make that choice. And I wonder in what ways you might think that is connected with the tool of social media. So you were referring before to the fact that that can help spread awareness. I don't know if I would put awareness as the same thing as understanding, because it seems to me that just the way that social media works, it's really good at generating heat for a short amount of time, or the spotlight, but the spotlight can move. It's fickle. That attention is fickle. And I guess, so boy, do I even have a question here. I guess what disturbs me is that, so it works at one level, maybe we say, justice is advancing, we're making progress. But at the other level, I don't know if it is. When you think about, there's no actual transformation of ideas. So maybe there's awareness, but I don't know if there's actually understanding that's happening. Does that make sense?
It does. I think what you're talking about, and this is an issue that I've actually already thought through this a little bit. And the issue is, I think what you're responding to is that it makes social justice seem transactional, right? And so if you do this, we'll do this. And the great example of this that I would like to set forth is actually about 175-ish years old. And that's the British abolition of slavery. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807. Okay, they did it by legislation. And the following year, the United States abolished the slave trade. They abolished the slave trade in America in 1808. But that's where America and Britain parted ways, because all of the history that came about after that in the US led us to civil war. But in the UK, what William Wilberforce did and others, they engaged slaveholders and people who had a financial stake in the continuation of slavery. And they, over time, won them over. So that in the UK, in 1833, finally, they were able to take a vote and get the slave trade abolished. But along with that, they also undertook an expense that was roughly 40% of the British national budget at the time, to reimburse the businessmen for what they perceived they were going to lose. Okay, and a lot of people think, well, that is not justice. But here's the thing. If we are looking for the outcome. The outcome was achieved, the abolition of slavery in all of the British dominions, not just Britain, but all British holdings around the world at the time, which were extensive. And basically, it was sort of the first shot that then allowed other nations to abolish the slave trade or slavery, except for the United States, which did not. Because we would not entertain that. We were much more purist in our approach, that this is a moral issue and you must act on the moral imperative. But the people who are twisted don't see the moral imperative. All they see is the selfish imperative. So in that case, you ended up with two sides that would not engage. And in that case, you can never solve a problem. So the thing is, if you want to solve a problem, the way to do it is to engage mutual self-interest, because I would argue, and I'm up for this argument, by the way, I would argue that the outcome of social justice is much more important than any money that we might lose to achieve it. Because once we have it, there's no going back. There's only going forward. And if that's the case, then this theory kind of makes sense, I think, in that way. But if we want to have sort of it seems to undercut the moral efficacy of the movement, I'll listen to that. But I also think that we're not likely to have much movement on issues of social justice if that's the paradigm that we take.
I just am realizing as I'm looking at the time, we are actually at time. So your invitation to keep hear other proposals, I'm afraid that might have to happen at another time and space. I hesitate even asking if there's a final question, because my hunch is we might need to talk for a bit. Is there a brief final question to wrap up our time? Or maybe we do need to table this.
Yeah. If there's not, that's okay. But if you have an idea, you can reach out to me by email, chris.underration@Gordon. That would be fine. I'm up to hear it, because I do think in this coming year, I'm going to try to write this paper. I already have a former graduate student doing a little bit of back-end research for me on this. So if you have some ideas, if you really think I'm missing the boat, or you see a flaw in this that really strikes you as obvious, I'm up to hear it, and I'm not offended, because that's kind of what this is all about. So let me know. All right.
Dr. Underration, thank you for sharing with us your work in progress. That's what these salons are all about, is sharing big ideas, provocative ideas, and gaining some feedback. This one certainly is timely. So thanks to you for sharing your ideas. And for those of you who were able to attend, thank you for your time this afternoon. And take Dr. Underration up on his invitation, reach out to him and continue this conversation. This is the last Fine Arts Salon of the semester. Stay tuned, we'll be announcing a schedule for the spring here in a few months. But thanks everyone for your time today. And thanks again, Dr. Underration, for this.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for dropping in.
Bye everybody, thank you. Bye.